The Diary of Lady Cassiopeia Vexleigh-St James, March 17th, 1786, written entirely under the influence of rage, wine, and satin. Dear diary, today I was publicly accused of ruining a man's reputation, derailing a duel, insulting a bishop, and seducing someone else's husband while standing next to my own. To which I say, what a productive evening. I should start at the beginning, but frankly, I'm still furious and half-corseted, so I'll just begin with the part where my husband, Lord Algernon Vexleigh-St James, Duke of Botherington and Eternal Embarrassment, told me to my face. To the dungeon, woman. Imagine, me, a woman who hand-selected every tapestry in this estate. A woman who hasn't missed a masquerade ball in 12 years, 6 scandals, and 1 attempted arson. A woman who survived my mother-in-law's Christmas goose without flinching. Being sent to the dungeon, metaphorical or otherwise, because I may have, allegedly, possibly, entirely intentionally flirted with Prince Dorian of Montvalèche over a glass of plum cordial and a bowl of flaming pudding. He was flirting first. Also, pudding was on fire. Anyway, let's rewind. This morning, I awoke to my husband humming a terrible sea shanty in the bath. He does this when he thinks he's being manly. He is not. He is shaped like a breadstick and sweats when confronted by strong cheese. He informed me we'd be attending the Grand Carnival Masquerade at Countess Hollowmere's estate, and that he had taken the liberty of ordering me a mask. I asked what kind. He said, a modest one. A modest mask, for me. I reminded him gently, with a letter opener, that the only thing modest about me is my tolerance for his opinions. Of course I chose the gown myself. Crimson velvet, off-shoulder, scandalously laced at the sides. A neckline that flirted with indecency. A skirt that whispered, Your Grace, you're about to make a mistake. He wore black, like a funeral guest, which was fitting. At the ball, the usual suspects paraded by, simpering debutantes, powdered men whispering stock tips, Lady Penelope Winterbourne, who still insists her diamonds are heirloom, even though I saw her haggling for them behind the apothecary last spring. And of course, Prince Dorian. Prince Dorian is a walking, talking problem. He's tall, brooding, and has the kind of accent that makes poetry sound like a promise and apologies sound optional. He looked at me over his goblet and said, Ah, Lady Cassiopeia, the only woman in England who makes sin look strategic. I nearly choked on my fig. My husband made a noise like a distressed ferret, which is when I smiled, batted my lashes, and said, Your Highness, I'm afraid my husband finds this conversation concerning. Dorian leaned in, entirely too close, and murmured, Then we're finally having fun. There was music, there was wine, there was a brief moment where someone juggled flaming pies. Everything was perfect, until the pear tart incident. Look, I didn't plan to eat the last pear tart, but I saw Lady Honoria reaching for it, and frankly, I hate her. She once told people I couldn't read Latin, and now I own 3 Latin Bibles and a footman named Marcus Aurelius purely out of spite. So I took the tart, and I ate it, sensually, with eye contact, with Prince Dorian, and moaned, just a little, for effect, which is when my husband, who had apparently been seething behind a ficus for 20 minutes, burst through the crowd, knocked over a bishop, grabbed a ceremonial sword off the wall, and screamed, To the dungeon, woman! In front of everyone! Even the flautist stopped. Now, in my defense, I didn't laugh immediately. There was a moment of stunned silence where I simply blinked at him, delicately set down my goblet, and replied, Darling, if you're going to make declarations, at least try not to sound like a deranged butler. He turned purple. Dorian raised an eyebrow. The bishop said, Well, that escalated. And then, chaos. Someone tried to duel someone. Someone else fainted into the lobster platter. I left with the tart tin. Back home, my husband demanded I apologize. I asked for what? For humiliating me in front of foreign royalty, he said. I said, Darling, you did that yourself by wearing those shoes and threatening your wife with medieval real estate. He hasn't spoken to me since, which is blissful. Now, the staff are whispering. The papers are predicting an annulment. My mother-in-law sent me a passive-aggressive psalm. Meanwhile, I'm in the rose parlor, drinking wine, writing this, and wearing nothing but the mask and a sense of absolute victory. Because here's the truth. He was boring before I married him. He was boring when I caught him reciting poetry to his cousin's goat. And he's boring now, which is why I needed a prince, a tart, and a moment of unfiltered entertainment to survive an evening in his presence. If I am to be sent to the dungeon, may it be for crimes of passion, drama, and phenomenal tailoring, and may the cell include wine. Yours in lace, lunacy, and legendary disgrace, Lady Cassiopeia Vexleigh-St James. Married? Probably, temporarily. Why I Accidentally Started a Cult at the Opera, by Lady Cassiopeia Vexleigh James, daughter of scandal, wife of inconvenience, patron saint of chaos. April 3rd, 1786. Location, somewhere between infamy and intermission. Dear Diary, let the record show, I did not mean to start a cult. Not at the opera, not during intermission, and certainly not while holding a half-eaten truffle and a flute of champagne in the third best box seat, which, by the way, was already an insult. I simply made one dramatic statement, a perfectly reasonable wine-enhanced musing, and 6 people threw themselves at my feet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin with the cause of this particular descent into lunacy. My husband. Lord Algernon Vexleigh-St James. Still my husband. Technically. Like mildew is technically part of a damp wall. He had insisted, we attend the Royal Opera House's spring gala performance of Il Trionfo d'Italia, a turgid 5-hour nightmare of tragic sopranos, heroic moaning, and wigs so large they deserve their own postal codes. Culture is important, he said. I countered that so is not dying of boredom, but was outvoted by his stupid face. I wore black satin, corset like vengeance, earrings like weapons, the sort of ensemble that makes men confess to crimes they haven't committed. I also wore gloves so long they could reach my better judgment and strangle it. He wore beige. That's all I'll say. Beige. In public. Things began spiraling during Act 2, which, if you are unfamiliar with 18th century opera, is usually when everyone who was pretending to enjoy themselves starts fantasizing about spontaneous fire. I leaned over and whispered, if this soprano wails one more time, I shall personally join her on stage and perish dramatically. Algernon hissed at me to behave. So, I said nothing. Out loud. But I began to radiate menace, which is one of my best talents. By intermission, I'd endured nearly 2 hours of passionless tragedy, and my husband's attempts to explain symbolism. Symbolism from a man who once confused a bidet for a wine chiller. We retired to the lobby, where champagne flowed, gossip curdled, and several ladies stood near the oysters pretending not to want them. I drifted toward the balcony for air, and that's when it happened. I was alone with a handful of attendees, young, bored socialites, and 2 vaguely mystical-looking widows, all beautiful, vaguely intoxicated, and desperately looking for meaning. One of them, Lady Honoria, who has been 3/4 spiritually possessed ever since she tried laudanum with a Spanish painter, sighed and said, I just feel so lost. Without missing a beat, I took a sip of champagne, turned toward the moonlight, and said, Then be found, darling. We are not women. We are meteors in silk. Collide gloriously. There was a pause. Then someone gasped, and someone whispered, She's right. And someone else knelt. Diary. In opera gloves. 5 minutes later, I had followers. 10 minutes later, I had an impromptu name, the Divine Order of the Velvet Flame. It started as a joke. I said, Rise, children of chaos. They applauded. I told them to abandon their fears and unleash their inner drama. Lady Daphne immediately slapped her fiancé. They asked what we believe in. I said, revenge, velvet, and being seen. They called me Madam Ember. I didn't stop them. Then someone brought me a goblet of wine and said, For the rights. What rights? What the hell were the rights? I said nothing. I just raised the glass and shouted, Tonight, we drink not in despair, but in defiance. For every opera that bored us, for every man who's told us to calm down, for every beige waistcoat we've suffered in silence. They roared. I was drunk with power. Also champagne. We returned to the box for Act 3, now with 7 women in matching crimson shawls and 1 man named Cyril who'd painted his chest. The soprano sang. We sang with her. The audience stared. Algernon stared harder. Then, I'll never forget this. My husband turned to me, fists clenched in horror, and actually shouted, To the dungeon woman, as if he owned one, as if I hadn't emotionally redecorated it years ago. After the performance, we were asked gently to leave through the back exit, A violinist bowed to me. The Duchess of Weatherby said I was an unstable influence. I said, "Thank you. So rare to be properly understood." We reconvened in my rose parlor, where the cult, I prefer informal sorority of beautifully unstable women, held our first gathering. We shared wine, secrets, burned my husband's portrait in a silver saucer. One of them called it a cleansing ceremony. I called it Tuesday. Now the ton is talking. Algernon is hiding in his fencing room. Lady Honoria sent me a letter covered in flower petals and wax seals, asking when our next sermon will be. Someone embroidered "Unleash Your Inner Drama" on a cushion. I've received a gift basket from Vienna. And the soprano, she sent me a note that said, "Next time, let's duet." So yes, diary. I may have started a cult, but I've never been applauded harder. And honestly, this is the most fun I've had since the masquerade that ended with a duel and a fainting goat. Let them gossip. Let Algernon rage. Let the duchesses mutter in prayer. I am Madame Ember now. And I look incredible in red. Yours in chaos, candles and couture, Lady Cassiopeia Vexleigh-St James. High priestess of petty, patron of pearls, unapologetically divine.